this in a moment. Look, I'm talking about trade policy, the history of Canadian trade policy, and the evolution of Canadian trade policy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about investments. But I'm a lawyer, I'm an international lawyer, so I look at things in terms of the global structure, okay? And I'm going to start by just saying a word about where we are today on trade negotiations. The whole business of NAFTA is frankly perverse. The Americans are negotiating in bad faith. They're threatening to walk out unless they get their way. That would not be tolerated in any collective bargaining situation. That's not how you deal with trading partners. And in fact, the difficulty we have now in the NAFTA negotiations, and I'm talking about the NAFTA because I think it brings to focus a lot of things about the evolution of Canadian trade relations with the United States, Canadian trade policy, and there'll be something I'm going to say about investment policy. The reason I say the situation is perverse is because we're negotiating with a trading partner who doesn't share any of the objectives that we have. The whole purpose of trade negotiations is to achieve a common objective, reduce trade barriers, improve market access for the benefit of the trading partners. That's what led to the Free Trade Agreement in the 1980s, and it led to the NAFTA. And indeed, it's the foundation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the World Trade Organization Agreement. Common objectives to reduce trade barriers. And what we have now is a disconnect. We've got our major trading partner saying, I want to put up barriers. We, the United States, this administration, is pursuing an America First trade policy, and their objectives are diametrically opposed to Canada's and Mexico's. And indeed, their withdrawal from the Paris Accord and the trade, the TPP, and scuttling negotiations with Europe is a retrenchment from everything that trade negotiations are supposed to be about. So that's my view of where we are today. I frankly think these negotiations, and I'm speaking frankly, I've been involved in negotiations with the Americans when I was in government, representing Canada in the United Nations and the GATT, and as a private practitioner dealing with the Americans on an ongoing basis. And I don't think these negotiations will succeed. I think we are on the precipice of a serious rupture in our trading relationship with the United States, and the Canadian business community has to be prepared for that. What will happen? We can talk about the scenarios, but I'm supposed to be talking about Canadian business history, not the future. So that's where we are today. But I wanted to talk about Canadian trade policy history because that's what I thought this discussion was all about. You see that? No truck or trade with the Yankees. Does anybody know where that comes from? Anybody? The 1911 election. Very interesting. There was some mention of MacDonald's national policy after Confederation. You know, we've had trade agreements with the United States before and after Confederation. There was a reciprocity treaty, 1854, 1866, that the Americans abrogated. It was negotiated when Canada was still a colony. It was abrogated in 1866. It was one of the factors leading to Confederation when the reciprocity treaty was terminated by the Americans. The result is, and I won't go into all the detailed history, but the result is the establishment by the Conservative government under John A. Macdonald of a national policy, high tariffs, protectionism. Over the course of the next number of decades, from 1878, when Macdonald came back into power, until Laurier formed the government, that policy of high protection, high tariffs remained in place. The Laurier government negotiated a reciprocity treaty with the United States. And that's one of the cartoons that was published in newspapers, including the Globe and the Star, in Toronto, that opposed free trade with the United States. Opposed free trade with the United States. The Canadian business community, led in part by the person whose mansion houses the law faculty, Sir Joseph Lavelle, just across the way, were entirely opposed to the dismantling of protectionist tariffs because it would impact on Canadian manufacturing. Next slide. I'm just showing you a few of the slides. I think they're a few of the cartoons. You can't see that very well, but there's United States trusts feeding at the trough, and the poor farmers, you see the poor farmers there, having to feed the trough to satisfy the U.S. trusts. Next. You want to do the next one? And there is Laurier trying to wrestle to the ground the Canadian resources. You see it's a cow, in order to supply those resources to the United States, looking over the fence. The Canadian business community was solidly opposed to free trade in the 1911 election, and hence the expression, no trucker trade with the Yankees, and the Laurier government went down to defeat over the reciprocity treaty with the United States. Interestingly, again, because this is about history, interestingly, that treaty, the reciprocity treaty of 1911, was approved by the United States Congress. It was approved by the United States Congress and rejected by Canada. It's interesting, isn't it, when you think about it? So what happened since? Do you want to just flip to the next slide? There's Laurier, U.S. Trust, again, a cartoon that ran in the Toronto Star. I think next, just go to the next. Reciprocity beaten, government overwhelmed, board majority. So that, it's interesting, sheds light on where we were 100 years ago. So what happened after that? Again, a lot of this is history, and may not be as important as where we're going to go from this point on with our American friends. But in the aftermath of that, tariffs remained in place. The devastation of high protective tariff walls during the 1930s, any student of Canadian business history knows about that. There was a limited free trade agreement concluded between Canada and the United States in 1938, believe it or not, which was never implemented because the war came, and then after the war, it entered into force but was never fully implemented in 1938. During the war, all of the provisions of that limited free trade agreement with the United States, the 38 agreement, was put on hold. And then, after the war, we had the multilateral process taking over. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was concluded in 1947. And so that bilateral treaty with the United States was left unfulfilled. And the multilateral process took over. Okay? So the multilateral process continued, and eventually, because we were permitted to do that, you know the story, Canada entered into a bilateral trade agreement with the United States in the 80s, 1987, entered in force in 1989, and was replaced by the NAFTA. Coming back to what I said before, the free trade agreement and the NAFTA were based on common shared objectives of the negotiating parties. We want to have an agreement in North America that reduces tariffs and allows for the free flow of goods, services, and capital among us. And again, as I said, that common objective has been shattered. So let me just add a couple of points on trade negotiations and the process of dismantling protectionism. It will not happen on a unilateral basis. We are not, Professor, going to dismantle tariffs unilaterally. Why would we do that? We want to negotiate. Tariffs are part of an international structure of trade, and reducing tariffs requires negotiations. You want something from the other side, you have something to give. You don't unilaterally disarm because then you've got nothing, you've got no leverage. And I'm not suggesting that for a moment that it's not in Canada's interests to open up markets, but It ain't going to happen. We're not going to reduce our tariffs unilaterally. We're not going to unilaterally get rid of supply management, as retrograde as that system is. And I've gone public with that point, and I get emails as a result as well. It's going to be done through negotiation. The dismantling, to take supply management as an example, the dismantling of supply management will only come about through external pressure, through a system, process of trade negotiations where we give up something in order to get something in return. And it's just the way it works. Now let me come to FDI. And again, because I'm a trade lawyer, I'm looking at this from a legal perspective. And I thought we had a very good presentation of the internal domestic policies behind foreign investment reviews. I just want to talk a little bit about the framework in international relations and the system of what we now call ISDS, investment dispute settlement systems. Because part of what we do domestically is geared to the international system and the framework we have in the NAFTA and in the 30 or 35 bilateral investment protection agreements that Canada has around the world. The idea behind investment protection agreements was really and it emerged in the 1960s, partly through a process of policy development in the UN Convention on UN Conference on Trade Development, and the UNCTAD in the UN, and gradually it was accepted that one of the ways to encourage capital flows from north to south was to have a framework wherein foreign investors were protected in host countries. And so that led to the evolution of a multitude of bilateral foreign investment protection agreements. There's over 3,000 of them around the world today. 3,000. All of which have, or most of which have, a system of dispute settlement through ad hoc arbitration processes. Not ideal. Lots of problems with that system. Lots of legal problems, as my friend Jim Arnett and I have discussed. Lots of problems. But they're there. And we're not going to deal them away. We have to live with the fact that in the international system, there will be arbitrations brought by private companies challenging host country regulations, even though as we enter the modern era, there's growing public concern about allowing private parties to challenge government action when major issues of public policy are involved. That is a process that has, even among those in the international community, including international jurists who strongly supported bilateral investment protection agreements in the 1960s and 1970s in order to assist in the development flows north to south and encourage capital going to the developing world. There is a growing sense of unease about these dispute settlement mechanisms and how they allow ad hoc panels to decide on major issues of public policy. And that is an issue that is being raised in the context of the current NAFTA negotiations with the Americans. Interestingly, a lot of American interest groups are saying they don't particularly like ISDS because it might allow Canadian companies, of all things, to target American legislation or regulations implemented for public policy reasons. But the fact is that U.S. Investors have used the ISDS system in the NAFTA, famous Chapter 11, to challenge a lot of Canadian measures. And this has caused some political angst in Canada. Notwithstanding what I've said about the NAFTA negotiations, I don't know what's going to happen on the investment dispute system. I'm not sure it will, if the NAFTA ever sees the light of day, these negotiations. I'm not sure where it'll come out. But it is a fact that even though the system was enshrined in the NAFTA as a means of placing discipline on Mexico, which was seen by the Americans as being a risky place to invest where the rule of law was not assured, the American investors have used that system to challenge Canadian measures much more often, in fact, the most often, party challenged by these investor-state dispute settlement systems has been Canada. Now, the good news is that the results have not been particularly favorable to the investors, the U.S. investors. There's never been a challenge brought by a Mexican investor against a Canadian measure. So that is the framework. Coming back to our national policy on investment review, again, politically it's difficult, if not impossible, to do any change, make any changes unilaterally, because it is, our investment review process is used as a bargaining chip in the trade negotiations, and the clearest example is what happened in 1987 in the final stages of the free trade negotiations with the Americans, where Canada was pushing for a binational panel review on trade decisions, the famous Chapter 19, which is under discussion now. Remember, the Mulroney government said that this is the centerpiece of our deal with the Americans. We want a binational panel system to review decisions of trade agencies because we're being hammered by U.S. anti-dumping countervailing. We got that because Jim Baker, Secretary of the Treasury, said, we'll give that to you. Remember, there was 11th hour, 11 and a half hour, 1 minute to midnight negotiations. And James Baker said, okay, the deal is you raise your thresholds on U.S. investment reviews, and we'll agree to the binational panel system. That's essentially what happened. I mean, it's not, there were other things on the table, but that was one of the critical factors that led Baker and Reagan to agree at the last minute to accept binational panels. So my point is that with so many things involving trade, tariffs, investments, these are elements that Canada will use in international negotiations, and unilateral changes are just something that really can't be envisaged. So there we are. I don't know whether I've related your comments or yours, but I've tried to kind of bring these together and talk a little bit about the evolution of Canadian trade policy and Canadian investment policy in these brief remarks. So thank you very much.